It seemed that we knew everything about the army. In films and books, it was portrayed as majestic and heroic, and songs extolled military camaraderie, loyalty to the oath, and the honor of the uniform. But over time, it became clear that our view rarely penetrated beyond the first parade line, where everything shines and looks exemplary. In reality, behind the facade, behind the orderly rows and loud speeches, another life was hidden, a harsh, contradictory, and sometimes cruel one. Times change, but what remains unchanged is that different people join the army, and not everyone can withstand its trials. Some show strength of character and become true warriors, while others make mistakes and end up in places it is better not to know about. This is how the Disciplinary Battalion came into being, a special unit where offenders from the armed forces were sent. Among them were those who violated statutory relations, disobeyed orders, or engaged in barracks hooliganism. These people were called different things. Some saw them as renegades, others as victims of circumstances. But for everyone, they became an example of how the army does not forgive weaknesses and does not tolerate arbitrariness. At the same time, every soldier, upon joining the armed forces of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, uttered the sacred words of the oath. I, a citizen of the USSR, upon joining the armed forces, solemnly swear. To the sound of applause and music, a new generation of soldiers rose to the banners. These young men swore to defend their homeland with their lives. But few of them realized that the very next day in the barracks, they would encounter not only harsh military discipline, but also rudeness, arbitrariness, and unregulated relations. The long-standing tradition of hazing had existed in the army for years. It turned military service into a difficult ordeal and made the lives of young soldiers unbearable. Outwardly, everything looked fine in the army. At meetings, there was talk of military duty, mutual assistance, and brotherhood. Officers spoke of discipline and pride, but in reality, a different life began in the barracks, one not provided for in the regulations. There, it was not the letter of the law that prevailed, but the strength, arrogance, and experience of the old-timers. Yuri Polyakov wrote about all this in his novel, 100 Days Before the Order. He decided to show the army that others had tried to ignore before him, the real army, with all its contradictions and pain. For many years, literature portrayed the army in a distorted way, heroic, benevolent, as if it were another world where ideals reigned supreme. But what readers encountered on the pages of books did not coincide with the reality that every young man faced when he came to serve in the military. So that young people would not experience, you understand, that bitter disappointment, or even real resentment against literature, which lies too beautifully and lulls them with sweet words, but does not prepare them at all for the real difficulties of service and life. Because the truth is that the army is not just parades, songs, and solemn oaths. Unregulated relations are not just fights, beatings, or rare criminal cases. They are much broader, deeper, and, one might say, more invisible. Unregulated relations manifest themselves in any form of humiliation of a comrade in the barracks or unit, in any attempt to use his subordinate position for personal gain. And it is important to understand that such phenomena exist not only among conscripts. Unregulated relations are a disease of the system, a form of its existence. They manifest themselves between sergeants, among officers, and even in the highest echelons, between generals. It is a way of subjugating the weak to the strong, of exerting pressure through experience, position, or power. And, if you think about it, to some extent this is a reflection of society as a whole, because injustice, abuse, and the desire to suppress others also flourish in it. An excerpt from the play based on Yuri Polyakov's novel 100 Days Before the Order gives a vivid picture of this negative phenomenon. It shows how young soldiers, who were schoolchildren only yesterday, end up in barracks where their own laws reign supreme. Instead of learning military skills, they are confronted with rudeness and ridicule, with demands to carry, do, obey. The seemingly mundane conversations of the senior soldiers are filled with mockery and memories of the school of life, where humiliation was considered natural, even mandatory. If only Mazeyev were here, he would teach you how much I washed, how much I crawled. And all this is presented as experience that must be passed on. The play features lines such as, "Give me a light, you remember how he." "We went through Mazeyev's school of life, I'll remember it until I die." These words convey both pride and bitterness. The senior soldiers seem to justify their cruelty by the fact that they themselves went through it, so it is right for the young ones to go through it too. The young ones find themselves in a defenseless position, forced to endure. When we first arrived at the unit, the first week seemed relatively tolerable. Everyone was happy to be in the army, to have begun real military life. But that joy was quickly replaced by harsh reality. Around the barracks, they began to chase us around in gas masks until our legs literally gave way and we fell from exhaustion. Those who couldn't keep up and ended up on the ground on the second or third lap were roughly lifted up, sometimes by their feet, and chased on again. There was no pity or understanding, only the demand to endure and bear it. This was followed by endless push-ups, forced marches, night formations, and pointless duties. They could wake us up in the middle of the night and make us clean toilets, scrub floors, and do other menial tasks. Any little thing became a reason for nitpicking. The deputy platoon commander constantly picked on the boys. A hook on a gym shirt wasn't fastened, a button wasn't sewn on right, boots weren't polished enough. Sometimes the soldier didn't even have time to explain himself before he was hit with a fist or a rifle butt, and sometimes he was simply humiliated in front of everyone. This constant nitpicking and bullying broke their spirits. Many tried to endure it, but not everyone had the strength. Some tried to find justification for what was happening, considering it a school of life, but for some young guys, it all became unbearable. That's when tragedies occurred. One of the units gradually turned into a kind of isolation ward for soldiers who couldn't withstand the pressure. It was home to young men who had attempted suicide, who were mentally broken and exhausted to the limit. Their social backgrounds varied greatly: students, workers, village boys, even those who had already worked or had families. But they all had one thing in common: the unbearable pressure of service and non-statutory relations. Attempts to take their own lives were most often related to harassment. Some were driven to despair by senior soldiers who demanded obedience and mocked them. Others were broken by their superiors, junior and senior commanders who, instead of educating soldiers, turned their lives into a constant nightmare. And when a soldier found himself in a situation where, as he saw it, there was no way out, he took a desperate step. Unfortunately, such tragedies were not uncommon. The Literary Gazette, in its October 8, 1988 issue, wrote about a new tragedy. Vlad Ignatenko, a student at the Kiev Polytechnic Institute, committed suicide after only 3 months in the army. He was hounded by constant bullying, broken by humiliation and exhausting workloads. He was so physically and mentally exhausted that he reached the point where life seemed impossible. Unfortunately, it is not only the personal weakness of young soldiers that leads to such actions, but also constant pressure from senior soldiers, with the full connivance of some officers who either turn a blind eye to what is happening or consider it all to be part of the educational process. However, times are changing. Today, such cases are increasingly becoming the subject of serious investigation. Before our eyes, a military tribunal hearing is opening. The chairman declares it open and announces that a criminal case will be heard against a military builder, Private Amano Kadar Sizembekovich Cherkassky. This is a show trial, which is intended to demonstrate to both the barracks and the so-called hooligans in uniform that the days of impunity are over. Colonel of Justice Lyubimov explains the essence of legal protection. He emphasizes that the current legal norms guarantee the honor and protection of the personal dignity of every military serviceman, including the youngest soldiers who have just arrived at the units. An article has been added to the legislation stipulating that if a military serviceman is subjected to violence or harm by another person, his response in self-defense is not considered a criminal offense, but is considered lawful. This is extremely important for young men who previously had no legal means of protection. In addition, there is an article in the Fundamentals of the Legislation of the Union Republics that enshrines the right to so-called necessary defense. That is, if a soldier is attacked by a senior soldier, he has every right to defend himself, to fight back, and his actions will not be considered a crime. Moreover, fellow soldiers who witness such an attack also have the right to intervene and use force in response. This is a fundamental change. Now the charter and laws serve as a shield for those who previously felt defenseless. The time for hushing up negative phenomena is over. Hazing is being taken seriously. The work of political departments has been intensified, and the Komsomol, military prosecution, and judicial authorities have been brought in. A systematic fight against this ugly phenomenon, which is too deeply rooted in the army environment, is beginning. However, as experts emphasize, the army alone is not enough. The disease is too advanced, and its cure must become a common cause. Fostering respect and preventing humiliation must begin in the family and at school, continue in the military registration and enlistment office, and be supported by the Komsomol and the Army Command. After all, this is not just a matter of discipline or following orders. It is about the fate of our sons, about the lives of young people who must serve, defend their homeland, and return home, rather than perishing or being broken morally due to arbitrariness. Yes, I had to temporarily perform the duties of platoon commander because the commander himself was on leave at the time. The atmosphere in the unit was tense, everyone's nerves were on edge. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore. I ended up hitting a fellow soldier 3 times in the jaw. The doctors classified the injuries as minor. But the army is not the street. Here, every action is judged more strictly. As a result, I was convicted under Article 260. And if the case had ended there, everything might have turned out relatively mildly. But then things took a turn for the worse. Another kick was too hard and ruptured the man's spleen. The injury was no longer considered minor, but serious and life-threatening. For this, I received a real prison sentence of 3 years. There was applause in the courtroom. Some people were happy that an example had been set, but for me it was a heavy stigma. Hazing does not come out of nowhere. It is not something new or accidental. It has been around since ancient times, passed down from generation to generation, from one draft to the next. Gradually, it became almost a habit, a kind of unwritten law ingrained in the army's consciousness. And it turns out that if one person tries to tell the truth, to speak out against it, he remains alone, and then dozens of others suffer because of his silence or carelessness. Many are afraid to speak out because they think, if I keep quiet, they won't touch me. But this is self-deception. The point is that some of these non-statutory relationships originate from those who have already served for some time, 6 months, a year, or even a year and a half. Such old-timers begin to dictate their rules, demanding order and discipline. But they are not at all interested in how this order is achieved, through respect or through humiliation. The main thing for them is to show their power. And this has a very serious impact on young soldiers. At that moment, I myself had only a few days left before going home, and perhaps that is why my nerves were particularly on edge. I also lost my temper, struck twice, and received 2 years. The term may not seem that long, but these are years taken away from my life. And the hardest part is the realization that I have sunk to the same level that I have always opposed internally. Today, I deeply regret what I did. I regret it not only because I was punished, but because I forever cast a shadow on the names of my parents, my family, and the team I served. It's a terrible feeling to realize that you yourself have become part of what you were supposed to fight against. It is worth thinking seriously and simply saying to yourself, stop, where are you going? Think, look around. Those guys who are sitting next to you at the same table today or standing together on the parade ground tomorrow may be among those who have gone down the slippery slope. You too could end up among them, and then it will be impossible to fix anything. One rash act, one flash of anger, or submission to a bad tradition can ruin all your plans, your whole life, everything you have built and believed in for many years. It is this simple truth that we want to convey to everyone who stands in the ranks today. We want them to realize that what has been said is not empty words for the microphone, not a showy speech for the sake of a checkmark, but a stern warning, experience paid for with the lives of others. But, unfortunately, not everyone understands this in time. And then comes bitterness, resentment, the feeling that life has suddenly, in an instant, been turned upside down and crossed out. Heavy remorse sets in, which does not subside for years and does not allow one to look calmly into the eyes of one's comrades or into the mirror at oneself. One of the most noticeable manifestations of non-statutory relationships is closely linked to the multinational composition of our army. The phenomenon of regionalism is familiar to everyone who has served in the military. In itself, it is not a bad thing. On the contrary, from a purely human perspective, it is even a positive phenomenon. When guys from the same region or republic find themselves in the same unit, it is easier for them to support each other, communicate in their native language, and share memories of home and loved ones. For many, this is a real moral support, especially in the first, most difficult period of service. But, as in any other situation, there is always a downside. Some unscrupulous military personnel begin to use the power of regionalism not to support their comrades, but to oppose their small circle to the rest of the army collective. In such cases, the regional association turns into a closed group, where its own rules, far from the charter, begin to operate. And then the danger begins. Such groups begin to dictate their will, impose their attitudes, and bend others to their will. Tension, friction between nations, mistrust, and sometimes outright conflict arise. And although officially the Army and Navy community always claimed that such phenomena had no place in the life of the units, in reality it was not easy to get rid of them completely. Yes, the charter is the same for everyone, discipline is mandatory, but you cannot treat everyone the same, completely ignoring the peculiarities of national psychology, traditions, and culture of individual peoples. This is a difficult task. On the one hand, maintaining a single order, and on the other, taking into account the characteristics of people, their inner world, upbringing, and habits. Commanders, political workers, and officers often had to balance between strict regulations and understanding human differences. This was especially evident in regiments where many representatives of the Caucasian republics served. For example, Armenians and Georgians. Among them, there were often those who considered themselves superior to others, were arrogant, and sought to subjugate others. No, of course, there were some good guys among them. Sometimes someone would approach me with respect and talk to me like a human being. But there were also situations that were blatantly obvious. Once, an Armenian came up to me, smiled, held out 3 rubles and said, "Here, take the money and go clean the toilet." I looked at him and asked, "Why should I go and clean it? Are you better than me?" He was half a head taller than me, a strong guy, and he replied arrogantly, "That's how we do things, we don't do it ourselves." They said it wasn't customary for them to wash floors, scrub toilets, or clean up after themselves. At most, they'll make their beds, and even then, they'll do it half-heartedly. Everything else is someone else's responsibility. And if their senior gets involved in such a situation, regardless of whether he is right or wrong, he will always defend his fellow countrymen. As a result, the entire burden of household chores falls on the shoulders of the others. We end up having to work for ourselves and for them. And then tension begins to build in the barracks, resentment arises, and there are conversations about who is a nationalist, who is Armenian, who is Azerbaijani, who is Russian or Ukrainian. But each of us was a soldier in the same army, in the same country, and we were all supposed to be equal before the regulations and our duties. It was very upsetting, especially when you realize that you are not respected not because you are a bad soldier or violate discipline, but only because you are not one of them, not from their region. And at such moments, we would quietly exchange glances and say to each other, "Enough is enough, how long can we put up with this?" It's not only their shame, but ours too. We ourselves are ashamed that we allow this to happen. Gradually, we came to understand that we needed to stick together and not allow ourselves to be broken by such humiliating tactics. After all, the problems of the army are always a reflection of the problems of society. And if injustice is allowed in the barracks, it is not only because of the character of specific individuals, but also because the roots of this rudeness and indifference lie in the country itself. We were used to talking about shortages of soap, toilet paper, cars, or other material things. But we rarely thought about the fact that there was another, more terrible shortage, a shortage of culture, mutual respect, tolerance, and good manners. It is this invisible shortage that gives rise to rudeness, boorishness, and unwillingness to respect other people's opinions and human dignity. War veteran Lyubchenko totally agreed with this, often saying that the army's problems aren't just a separate thing, but part of the bigger picture of society. I believe that irregular relations in the army are a phenomenon that never goes unnoticed. It leaves an imprint on the souls of young soldiers and even on more mature people who are supposed to be resistant to stress and pressure. Young people are especially sensitive to this, of course. They are just beginning to form as individuals, and every word, every action, every injustice in the collective is perceived very acutely. Soldiers see how their superiors behave, how senior soldiers allow themselves to humiliate the weak, and they get the impression that this is normal, that this is how it should be. And if you think about it more deeply, the roots of this often lie in the family itself. A young person sees at home how his father treats his mother, how his parents earn a living. If they live on unjust income, if a child understands from childhood that success can be achieved through deception or force, then he develops the conviction, perhaps I can do the same. This gives rise to the law of the jungle within army collectives: disunity, spiritual deafness, egocentrism. When everyone strives only to survive on their own, without thinking about their comrades, then the very idea of army brotherhood disappears. And these processes have long ceased to be an abstract concept, a nice word in reports or newspaper articles. They have become a harsh reality. In the past year alone, juvenile crime in the country has increased by almost 20%. This is an alarming sign, because it is these teenagers who will join the army tomorrow, bringing with them not only a habit of cruelty or indifference, but also new vices, alcoholism and drug addiction, which are becoming a scourge of youth. But the army is not just a place of service, it is a school of life, on which the combat capability of the country and its security directly depend. In this situation, one can only sympathize with the commanders. They bear an incredible responsibility to maintain discipline and instill a sense of camaraderie and honor in soldiers when there are so many negative examples around them. After all, modern military specialties require not only endurance, but also serious knowledge, technical literacy, and the ability to make quick decisions. It takes more than just physical strength and courage. It also requires intelligence, self-control, and psychological stability. Still, I want to believe that the new recruits, the young men who are joining the army today, will find themselves in healthy military units where mutual assistance, support, and respect reign supreme. May they be imbued with a spirit of true army brotherhood, and may their years of service not be a painful ordeal, but a time of growing up, a time they will later remember with gratitude and pride, so that each of them can say, "Yes, I served, and it was not in vain."